I woke up one morning to the sound of screaming. Not just any screaming, but the shrill, high-pitched screech of my neighbor, Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of our neighborhood. There she was, standing at the edge of my property, face as red as a fire hydrant, wailing like a banshee. But that wasn't even the best part. Her brand new luxury SUV was stuck, completely trapped in the middle of a massive trench I had legally dug around my driveway. A trench with a fully functional, medieval-style drawbridge that I could raise and lower at will. Rewind 2 weeks earlier, and none of this would have made sense. Back then, I was just a regular homeowner, a guy who wanted to live in peace and maybe grill some steaks on the weekend. But peace was impossible when you had Karen as the HOA president, treating the neighborhood like her personal kingdom. Karen was the type of person who measured your grass with a ruler, fined you for the wrong shade of beige on your shutters, and sent threatening letters if your car had so much as a speck of dirt on it. I'd had enough of her nonsense before, but I never imagined it would escalate to outright war. The trouble began one morning when I walked outside, coffee in hand, only to find Karen's oversized SUV parked directly across my driveway. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Maybe she had just pulled in for a second. But as I approached, I saw her standing on the sidewalk, arms crossed, that smug expression on her face like she was about to make someone's life miserable. "Morning, Karen," I said, trying to be civil. "Your car's blocking my driveway." She smiled like a cat watching a trapped mouse. "Oh, I know," she said sweetly. "It's my business. We've had some complaints about your driveway." I blinked. "Complaints from who?" "That's confidential," she said dismissively, waving her hand. "But we've decided your driveway doesn't comply with HOA standards." I looked at my driveway. It was a perfectly normal concrete slab. Nothing fancy, but certainly not breaking any rules. "That's ridiculous. There's nothing wrong with it." "Well," she said, inspecting her nails, "unfortunately, the HOA board has the final say. Until we conduct a proper review, I'll need to keep my vehicle here to prevent further infractions." I stared at her, waiting for the punchline. "You're joking." "Nope," she chirped, pulling out a clipboard and scribbling something down. "Oh, and I should mention that if you try to tow my car, that'll be considered harassment. HOA rules." I wanted to argue, to yell, to do something, but I knew Karen. She thrived on confrontation. She wanted me to lose my temper so she could slap me with more fines and complaints. So instead, I took a deep breath, nodded, and walked back inside. The next few days were hell. Every morning, I woke up to find Karen's car still blocking my driveway. The HOA refused to help. When I called a tow company, they refused, citing some vague community agreement. Meanwhile, Karen strutted around like she owned the place, acting like she had won the lottery. Then came the fines. Apparently, I was now being penalized for neglecting driveway maintenance, since I couldn't use my own driveway because, it was blocked. Every time I checked my mailbox, there was a fresh letter demanding payment. It was infuriating, but I wasn't the type of guy to just roll over and take it. If Karen wanted to play dirty, I was going to play smart. I spent the next few nights doing what I did best: research. If the HOA was going to weaponize its rules, I was going to find my own legal loophole. After hours of digging through zoning laws and property codes, I found it. A single line in the local ordinances that changed everything. It turned out there were no regulations against making security modifications to private property. That meant I could legally build a barrier around my driveway as long as it wasn't a permanent structure. I double-checked, triple-checked, and even called a lawyer friend to confirm it was airtight. And that's when the real fun began. The next day, I rented an excavator and hired a crew. I told them I wanted a deep, wide trench around my driveway. Not a little ditch, a full-on, medieval-style moat. They thought I was crazy, but hey, money talks. By the time the sun set, my driveway was surrounded by a 4-foot deep trench, wide enough that no car could cross it. The next morning, I waited for Karen's inevitable reaction. Sure enough, she stormed over, ready to gloat. But the moment she saw her SUV stranded in the middle of the trench, her expression went from smug to sheer horror. "What the hell is this?" she screeched. "Oh, just some security modifications," I said, barely suppressing my grin. "HOA rules say I can do it." Karen's eye twitched. "You can't just dig a hole around my car." "Sure I can," I said. You see, this is my property, and since you refused to move your car, I had no choice but to build around you." She looked like her brain was short-circuiting. You, you can't. This is illegal." "Nope," I said, pulling out a printout of the zoning laws. "Totally legal. In fact, I even filed a permit. City approved." Karen's jaw clenched so tight I thought her teeth might crack. "You're going to regret this," she spat. "The HOA will not allow this." I shrugged. "Guess we'll see." And with that, I walked back inside, leaving her standing there fuming. The next morning, Karen was back. I could hear furious banging on my front door before I even got out of bed. I already knew who it was. Karen had spent the night plotting my destruction. When I opened the door, she was standing there, face flushed with anger, fists clenched tightly at her sides. The moment I stepped outside, she jabbed a perfectly manicured finger into my chest. "You need to fill that hole in right now," she seethed. I took a slow sip of my coffee, savoring the moment. The way her eye twitched at my lack of urgency was absolutely priceless. "Oh, you mean the trench?" I asked, feigning confusion. "Sorry, can't do that. It's a legal security measure." Karen let out a sound somewhere between a growl and a screech. "You have exactly 24 hours to fix this, or I will make sure the HOA fines you into oblivion." I pretended to think about it, taking another leisurely sip. "You know, that's interesting because I was actually about to make some improvements." Her narrowed eyes burned with suspicion. "What kind of improvements?" I grinned, feeling the rush of victory surge through me. "A drawbridge." Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. She blinked a few times, trying to process what I just said. "You can't just put a drawbridge in a suburban neighborhood," she said, her voice trembling. "Sure I can," I said with a shrug. "I already checked the regulations. As long as it's a temporary structure and not a permanent gate, I can build it. And since you're so concerned about my driveway, this will help keep it protected." She was visibly seething now, fists clenched so tightly I thought they might break. But instead of arguing further, she just stormed off, muttering threats under her breath about city inspectors, lawsuits, and how I was going to regret this. But I wasn't worried. I had done my homework, and I had a feeling this was only going to get more fun from here. The next few days were spent gathering materials and hiring the best contractors I could find. Building the drawbridge wasn't going to be an easy feat, but with the right team, I knew it would be a masterpiece. It wasn't about just blocking Karen's access to my driveway anymore. This was about making a statement. Construction began, and as the days went by, Karen grew more and more frantic. She called in city inspectors, expecting them to shut me down. But when they saw that everything was perfectly legal, they left with nothing to say. She even tried to organize a petition with the other homeowners, but most of them were just as sick of her as I was. One of her own supporters dropped out when he realized that I was in the clear. I found that out when he stopped by my house to ask if I needed any help with the project. He wasn't the only one. As word spread, more and more of the neighbors quietly supported me, though no one had the guts to speak up to Karen directly. Karen's attempts to stop me only seemed to make things worse for her. One of my contractors turned out to be the brother of a city councilman, and when Karen tried to block him from entering the neighborhood, the councilman's brother made sure that her influence wasn't going to be enough to stop the project. If she thought she could intimidate everyone into submission, she was sorely mistaken. And then after days of hard work, the drawbridge was finally completed. It was a thing of beauty, a sturdy wooden platform controlled by a simple pulley system that allowed me to raise and lower it whenever I pleased. The drawbridge made my driveway completely inaccessible to anyone without my consent. I couldn't wait to test it out. The next morning, Karen came storming over, ready for round two. But when she saw that my driveway was now fully protected, her eyes went wide and her expression changed from rage to pure disbelief. "This is insane," she screamed, throwing her arms in the air. "You can't have a medieval fortress in the middle of a neighborhood." "It's not a fortress," I said, standing proudly in front of my creation. "It's a security feature. You know, for protecting my property, HOA rules encourage security improvements." She looked like she was about to explode, but instead of fighting back, she just stomped off in defeat, her face contorted in frustration. I could tell she wasn't done, but I didn't care. The drawbridge was up, and she couldn't do anything about it. I tested it one more time, pulling the rope and watching with satisfaction as the drawbridge lifted, sealing off my driveway entirely. I couldn't help but chuckle as I looked over at Karen's SUV, still stranded in the trench. It was a perfect setup. I had won. Later that evening, as I was enjoying a drink on my front porch, I heard a rustling sound coming from the edge of my trench. My heart skipped a beat as I looked out the window and saw Karen, flashlight in hand, creeping around the trench like some kind of low-budget ninja. She was inspecting the drawbridge, clearly trying to figure out a way to sabotage it. Without thinking, I grabbed my phone and started recording. "Looking for something, Karen?" I called out, stepping out onto my porch. She whirled around, nearly losing her balance, but quickly regained her composure. "I was just making sure this ridiculous thing isn't a hazard." "You mean trespassing?" I said, raising an eyebrow. "Because that's what it looks like to me." She scowled but quickly tried to recover. "I'm on the HOA board. I have the right to inspect potential violations." "That's funny," I said, crossing my arms, "because last time I checked, the HOA doesn't own my property. But don't worry, I'll be sending this video to my lawyer, and maybe even posting it online. I'm sure the internet would love to see the HOA president sneaking around private property in the middle of the night." Her face drained of color. Without another word, she turned and hurried back to her house. The next morning, the neighborhood was buzzing. Word had spread about Karen's midnight snooping, and people were starting to turn against her. She tried to spin it, claiming she was just doing her job, but no one was buying it. Meanwhile, my story was gaining traction online. The video of the trench and drawbridge had gone viral, and the comments were pouring in, with thousands praising me for standing up to HOA tyranny. Karen had lost, and she knew it. The days after Karen's midnight mishap were tense, but filled with anticipation. I knew it wasn't over yet. If anything, I had a feeling Karen was only getting started. And sure enough, the storm came. It started small, an anonymous report to the city about unpermitted construction, followed by a surprise inspection from a zoning official who was clearly amused by the situation. He took one look at the drawbridge, shrugged, and left after confirming that everything was perfectly legal. But that didn't stop Karen. She escalated, filing fake noise complaints, accusing me of creating a safety hazard, and even claiming that my trench could cause structural instability in the neighborhood. I knew exactly who was behind it all. Without solid proof, though, it was just another round of harassment. But I was ready. I had been quietly gathering evidence of Karen's abuse of power, records of her misuse of HOA funds, threats and intimidation tactics against homeowners. She hadn't been nearly as careful with paperwork as she was with enforcing her petty rules. I compiled everything into a neat little folder, ready to strike when the time was right. The final showdown came during an emergency HOA meeting that Karen had called to discuss my so-called violations. She sat at the head of the table, smug and self-assured, convinced that this time she would finally win. "We've decided that your modifications are in violation of community standards," she announced, her voice dripping with triumph. "You'll need to remove them immediately, or you will be facing legal action." I smiled, pulling out my folder and placing it on the table. "That's interesting because I found some violations of my own." Karen frowned, her expression turning wary. "What are you talking about?" I opened the folder and began listing her misdeeds: fraudulent fines, misuse of HOA funds, and intimidation tactics against homeowners. The more I read, the paler she became. Her mouth opened to argue, but nothing came out. "I have proof," I said calmly, "and I'm willing to take this to the authorities." The room went silent. The other board members, most of whom had been too afraid to stand up to her before, suddenly looked very interested in what I had to say. Within minutes, Karen was voted out as HOA president. By the end of the week, an investigation into her shady dealings had begun. That night, I stood on my driveway, sipping a cold drink as I watched Karen's SUV being towed away, not by me, but by the authorities. My trench and drawbridge, which had started as a joke, had turned out to be the perfect way to expose her corruption. My driveway had never looked better, and Karen's reign of terror had finally come to an end. Karen was quiet for a few days after the HOA meeting. It was unsettling, but I knew she wasn't going down without a fight. It didn't take long before the fake complaints began, but this time, I was ready. One night, I was woken by the sound of a loud crash. My heart raced as I ran to the window. At first, I couldn't see anything, but when I turned on the outdoor lights, my stomach dropped. Someone had cut the ropes to my drawbridge, leaving it half collapsed into the trench. The wooden planks were cracked from the impact. I grabbed my phone and checked the security footage. There she was, Karen, dressed in black, holding a pair of bolt cutters. She had actually climbed into my trench and cut the mechanism herself. I didn't hesitate. I called the police. By the time they arrived, Karen had already fled back to her house. But the footage was all the evidence they needed. The officers knocked on her door, and after a tense few minutes, they dragged her outside, still screaming about how she was being harassed. She tried to spin the story, claiming she was preventing a neighborhood hazard, but the cops weren't buying it. They arrested her for trespassing and property damage. Watching her get handcuffed and stuffed into the back of a police cruiser was the most satisfying thing I had ever seen. The neighborhood exploded with gossip the next day. It turned out Karen had been causing problems for years, but no one had dared to stand up to her until now. The HOA board had no choice but to take action. They held an emergency vote and removed her from the HOA completely. Most of the remaining board members resigned, and the neighborhood voted to dissolve the HOA entirely. Turns out people were a lot happier without it. No more ridiculous rules, no more fines, no more fear of stepping out of line. As for me, I became a local legend. The story of my trench and drawbridge spread far beyond the neighborhood. News outlets picked it up, and I was soon being interviewed about my brilliant act of defiance. My videos went viral, and people from all over the world wanted to know how they could stand up to their own HOA nightmares. The lesson. The lesson from this story is simple. Sometimes you have to fight fire with fire. In a world where petty power struggles and corrupt systems seem impossible to change, creativity and determination can be your greatest allies. You don't always have to play by the rules if the rules are being used to oppress or control you. If you find yourself facing an obstacle that feels insurmountable, take the time to think outside the box and find your own way to break free. Also, don't underestimate the power of community. When people see that you're willing to stand up for what's right, they'll often rally behind you, even if they're too afraid to do so at first. And when that community comes together, real change can happen. Lastly, remember that sometimes a little humor and creativity can be the most powerful weapons in your arsenal. Karen's petty attempts to break me didn't succeed because I didn't meet her with anger or aggression. Instead, I outsmarted her, and in the process, turned the tables on her in a way that not only protected my property, but also exposed her true nature. In the end, the neighborhood was better for it, and for the first time in years, I finally felt at home.